I walked into the bank to close an old account with maybe $200 left in it. The manager looked at his screen, looked at me, and said, "Ma'am, are you aware of what's actually in this account?" The number on that screen was $48 million. Welcome to Kate's Fortune Stories. It's Kate again, and I'm so happy you're here with me. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe, because this story is only just beginning. My name is Renee Calloway, and before any of this happened, I would have told you my life was small in the good way. I was 54 years old, living in a brick ranch house on Sourwood Lane in Asheville, North Carolina, the kind of street where people leave their porch lights on for each other and everybody knows whose dog is whose. I had taught high school Spanish for 21 years at the same school, a job I loved with the specific, tired affection you develop for something that has cost you a great deal and given you more. I drove a silver Toyota Camry with 130,000 miles on it. I graded papers on Sunday nights with a glass of sweet tea going warm beside me. I was not a woman who expected surprises, and for most of my life, I hadn't gotten any. My husband, Walter Calloway, had died 11 months before that Tuesday. An aneurysm, sudden and merciless, while he was kneeling in the vegetable garden behind our house, pulling weeds from around the tomato plants he babied every summer like they were his third child. We had been married 24 years. I won't tell you it was a fairy tale, because marriages that last that long rarely are, but I loved him the way you love the walls of the house you live in. Quietly, structurally, without needing to say it out loud every day. After he was gone, I moved through grief the way most people do, unevenly, in fits and starts, sometimes fine for a week and then flattened by a smell or a song. That Tuesday morning, I drove to the Piedmont Trust branch on Marymount Avenue with one plain errand in mind. I wanted to close the old joint savings account Walter and I had opened years ago, back when we were saving for a camper we never bought. It had sat there collecting dust, and maybe $200 in interest for over a decade. I had already handled the checking account, the retirement accounts, all the ordinary paperwork of being a widow. This was the last loose thread, and I wanted it cut. The young man at the counter was polite in that trained, careful way, maybe 24, with a Piedmont Trust name tag that said Jordan. I gave him the account number. He typed, and then his face did something I will remember for the rest of my life. A kind of controlled flinch, like he'd touched something hot and wasn't allowed to react. He asked me to wait one moment and disappeared through a door behind the teller line. I wasn't alarmed. I assumed a computer glitch, or maybe the account needed extra paperwork because Walter was deceased. These things happen with old joint accounts. I checked my phone. I answered a text from my son. I waited maybe 6 minutes before the branch manager came out himself. His name was Mr. Halloran, silver-haired, the kind of steady, careful presence you'd want delivering bad news. He shook my hand and asked, gently but not really as a question, if I'd step into his office. "Mrs. Calloway," he said once the door was shut, "before we go any further with the closure request, I need to ask, are you aware of the current balance on this account?" I told him I figured it was small. A few $100s, if that. He turned his monitor toward me. $48,291,617.40. I stared at that number for what felt like a full minute without breathing. $48 million in an account I thought held loose change from a camper fund that never happened. "You didn't know about this," Mr. Halloran said. It wasn't really a question either. I told him no. The word came out much smaller than I meant it to. He explained, carefully, that he couldn't discuss the source of funds without proper documentation and authorization, that the account had shown significant activity over the past several years, deposits, transfers, a great deal of movement for what had once been a sleepy little savings account. He told me that given the size of the balance, any closure or withdrawal would require review, and that I might want to speak with an attorney before doing anything else. I drove home in something like a fog. I sat in my driveway for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. The house looked exactly the way it always looked. Walter's reading glasses were still on the side table because I hadn't been able to move them. The porch swing still creaked the same way it always had. Everything the same, and nothing the same at all. I am not naturally a suspicious person. I had trusted Walter completely for 24 years. But sitting alone in that quiet kitchen, I started doing something I had never let myself do before, running back through small moments I had never thought to question. The consulting trips to Charlotte that ran longer than they should have. The second cell phone I found once in his truck, which he said was for work, and I never asked about again. The way certain calls seemed to end the second I walked into the room. Had I been trusting, or had I simply chosen not to look? And underneath all of it, the question that frightened me most: if there was $48 million sitting in our joint account, whose money was it really, and who else out there knew it existed? I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark listening to the ceiling fan and pulling on threads I had spent years leaving alone. Walter had worked as an independent construction consultant, advising commercial developers on project costs and timelines. That was the version he gave at dinner parties, and it was true as far as it went. I'd seen contracts, met a few of his clients over the years, watched him leave for job sites in his work boots. Our income had always been comfortable, never extravagant. We took one real vacation a year. We had a paid-off mortgage and a modest retirement fund. Nothing about our life together had ever hinted at hidden millions. So where had $48 million come from? By 3 a.m, I was back at the kitchen table with my laptop, a legal pad, and the fireproof lockbox we kept under the bed. I had gone through that box after Walter died to settle the estate. Life insurance, the retirement account, the mortgage payoff letter, and that old joint savings account, which I remembered noting and setting aside to eventually close. Had I actually looked at the balance back then? I tried hard to remember. I recalled glancing at a statement once, early in the grief fog, and seeing a small number. But now I wondered if I had really read it or simply seen what I expected to see and moved on without looking twice. I logged into the bank's online portal with my own credentials. The account was there. The balance was there. $48 million, glowing on my laptop screen in the middle of my ordinary kitchen at 3 a.m. I clicked into the transaction history. The deposits stretched back nearly 5 years. Large, irregular sums. $600,000 here, $1.4 million there, all coming from a single source listed only as Cascade Ridge Holdings. I had never once heard that name in 24 years of marriage. The transfers only ever moved in one direction, until the final 10 months of Walter's life, when 2 withdrawals appeared. One for $1.1 million, one for $1.6 million, both sent to an account number I didn't recognize at all. My hands had gone cold. I thought about calling my son, Ethan, who lived in Denver, but Ethan had worshipped his father, and I wasn't ready to say something I couldn't take back. I thought about calling my sister, but she couldn't keep a secret from a houseplant, and whatever this was, it needed to stay quiet until I understood it myself. What I needed was a lawyer, not the one who had handled Walter's estate, because he had been Walter's man, chosen by Walter, and suddenly that felt important. I needed someone who was entirely mine. I also needed to know what Cascade Ridge Holdings actually was. The next morning I called in a personal day, my first in almost 3 years, and instead of opening my laptop at home, I drove to the downtown branch of the public library. Call it instinct. Call it the beginning of caution. I did not want to search any of this from our home network. Cascade Ridge Holdings turned out to be a Delaware-registered LLC. Beyond the basic filing, there was almost nothing public, no website, no press mentions, a registered agent's office in Wilmington that meant almost nothing on its own, since thousands of shell companies used the same kind of address. I printed everything the library database would give me, page after page of dry corporate filings, and spread it all across the little corral table like evidence in a case I hadn't yet admitted I was building. I cross-referenced the registered agent's address with two other LLCs that shared the same Wilmington suite number, both dissolved within a year of formation, both with names that sounded deliberately forgettable. Ashcombe Partners, Ridgeline Advisory Group. Neither told me much on its own, but the pattern told me something. Whoever had built this structure understood exactly how to keep it quiet, layer after layer, the way you build a house with no windows on purpose. But the name listed as managing member stopped my breath entirely. Victor Marsh. I knew that name. Victor Marsh had been Walter's college roommate at NC State, the best man at our wedding, a fixture at every holiday gathering for the first decade of our marriage, until a falling out I had never fully understood pulled him quietly out of our lives almost 15 years ago. Walter had told me, back then, that Victor had gotten mixed up in some shady real estate deals and that he'd had to cut ties for his own reputation's sake. I had accepted that explanation the way I accepted most of Walter's explanations, without pushing. Now I sat in a library corral in downtown Asheville thinking about Victor Marsh, $48 million, and two unexplained withdrawals sent out in the final year of my husband's life. And I made a decision. I was going to find out everything, quietly, carefully, and completely within the law. I was not going to touch that account. I was not going to tell a single soul what I knew until I understood far more than I did right now. And I was going to find myself a good attorney, someone who handled financial fraud and estate disputes, before I took one visible step in any direction. Was I scared? Yes. My heart hadn't settled since the bank. But fear, I was learning, is not the same thing as weakness. Fear is information, and I had just been handed a great deal of it. I drove home and started writing down every name from Walter's life I could remember, every thread I had been too trusting to pull before. A colleague from school had once mentioned an attorney named Monica Reyes in the context of her own ugly divorce, the one who doesn't blink, she'd called her. That sounded exactly like what I needed. I called Monica's office on a Wednesday and had an appointment by that Friday afternoon. Her office sat on the second floor of a converted mill building downtown, all exposed brick and quiet good taste. Monica herself was in her mid-40s, sharp-eyed, with the kind of stillness that made you feel like every word out of your mouth was being carefully filed away for later. I laid it all out for her in order: the bank visit, the balance, the transaction history, Cascade Ridge Holdings, Victor Marsh. I brought printouts. I brought the lockbox. She listened without interrupting once. When I finished, she sat quiet for a moment, then asked whether Walter had left a will. He had. I'd probated it myself, months earlier. Everything left to me and Ethan in equal shares. The estate at the time was valued at roughly $290,000, the retirement account, the house equity, a life insurance policy, some personal property. Nothing close to $48 million. Monica's expression didn't shift, but her pen tapped the legal pad once. The savings account was joint, she said, which means, technically, as the surviving account holder, that money passed to you automatically at the moment of his death by operation of law. It never would have appeared in the probate estate. I hadn't known that. Apparently, my old estate attorney hadn't thought to ask deeply about a decades-old joint savings account either. The real question, Monica went on, is where that money came from, and whether it represents proceeds from something that creates legal exposure for you or a claim from a third party. She looked at me directly. We need to understand exactly what Cascade Ridge Holdings actually did. She recommended a forensic financial investigator she'd worked with many times, a retired IRS agent named Sam Whitaker. I agreed. We set the terms. I wrote the retainer check with hands steadier than I expected them to be. I did not tell Ethan. Not yet. I went back to my ordinary life, the classroom, the lesson plans, the hallway duty between third and fourth period, and I waited. Except ordinary life had picked up a new quality now. The sensation of being watched. It started small. A car I didn't recognize, parked twice in 1 week down the block from my house. A gray sedan, out-of-county plates, a different spot each time but unmistakably the same car. A phone call from a blocked number that hung up the moment I answered. And then, 11 days after my meeting with Monica, a voicemail from a man who identified himself only as an old friend of Walter's, saying he'd heard I was asking around and would love to catch up over coffee sometime. I never called back. I told Monica everything. She told me to document it all, in writing with dates and times. Sam Whitaker worked faster than I expected. 3 weeks into the engagement, he sat down across from me in Monica's conference room and slid a folder across the table. Cascade Ridge Holdings had, for roughly 6 years, served as a vehicle for funneling undeclared consulting fees from 3 commercial developers working across the Carolinas and Georgia. It wasn't crude tax evasion. It was more layered than that. The developers had been inflating project cost estimates and skimming the difference through shell entities like Cascade Ridge, then distributing the proceeds to a small circle of people who provided legitimate-looking cover through consulting agreements. Walter had been one of those people. Victor Marsh had built and run the entire scheme. The $48 million wasn't entirely Walter's. Sam's best estimate, based on the flow of funds, put Walter's accumulated share at somewhere around $14 million. The rest had been temporarily parked in our joint account, most likely because Victor needed a quiet holding place while he restructured the network of distributions, and Walter had provided it. The 2 withdrawals, $1.1 million and $1.6 million, had gone straight to Victor Marsh personally through 2 separate accounts in the final year of Walter's life. Walter had known, Walter had participated, and Walter, in dying, had left me sitting on an account holding several $1 million that, in Victor Marsh's eyes, belonged to Victor Marsh, along with more than $30 million more that was legally and entirely mine. I sat in Monica's office and felt the floor tilt under me. The man I had loved for 24 years had been living an entire financial life I never once glimpsed. He hadn't told me. He hadn't protected me. He had simply left me holding it. And now Victor Marsh was circling. I knew we'd reached the point of no return when Monica said, "Renee, we need to talk about your options, because whoever left that voicemail already knows you've started asking questions." Monica's advice was direct. We needed to move before Victor did. The money in the joint account was mine by law, but that status could be challenged fast if Victor, or the federal government, moved first with a forfeiture claim or a fraud suit. The window wasn't infinite. Her plan had 2 parts. First, we would voluntarily approach the IRS Criminal Investigation Division through her office, disclosing the account and positioning me as a cooperating witness rather than a target. Voluntary disclosure carries real, documented legal protection when it comes before an investigation is formally opened. Second, we would petition the probate court to reopen Walter's estate on the grounds that assets had been omitted, which would fold the account into a formal legal process and make any outside claim much harder to execute quietly. It wasn't a perfect plan. Nothing about any of this allowed for perfect. But it was clean, it was legal, and it moved first. Monica filed the paperwork on a Thursday. Sam prepared a financial summary for the IRS contact. By Friday afternoon, Monica had already spoken with an agent named Delgado out of the Charlotte field office, who received the disclosure without any drama and asked us to sit tight for an initial review. I went home that evening and made dinner, chicken and rice, the same simple thing I'd made most Fridays for 20 years. I sat at the kitchen table and ate alone and thought I did something irreversible today. There was grief tangled up in it, because irreversible meant Walter was no longer someone I could shield from judgment. But there was something else in there too, something I hadn't felt in 11 long months. Agency. I had done something. I had chosen. I slept 5 hours that night, the best stretch I'd managed since the bank. The call came the following Saturday morning. The voice on the other end was smooth, warm, achingly familiar from a decade and a half of holiday dinners and old wedding photos. Victor Marsh. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. Renee. Just my name, said in a certain tone, the tone of a man who considers his own patience a form of generosity. I think you and I need to talk about what you've been up to this week. He knew. Of course he knew. He had contacts, networks, the kind of reach Walter used to describe, half admiringly, as a man who keeps a finger in everything. The real question was how much he knew specifically. I kept my voice level. Victor, I don't think there's anything for us to discuss. A pause. I'm going to say this once, as a friend. Whatever you've filed, whoever you've talked to, walk it back. You don't understand the whole picture. Walter made certain commitments. Those don't just disappear because he's gone. I asked what kind of commitments. The kind, he said, that could make your life very complicated. The kind that could get the IRS looking at you, not just the account. You're sitting on money you didn't earn and by your own account didn't even know about. Or so you claim. How does that look, Renee? An innocent widow, or a woman who's been quietly living off it for years and is suddenly trying to look surprised? It was a threat dressed up as concern, the most dangerous kind there is. I told him I had an attorney now and that all future contact needed to go through her. Then I hung up. I sat on the edge of my bed for a solid 10 minutes afterward because my legs didn't feel entirely trustworthy. Monica, when I called her, wasn't surprised in the slightest. He's testing what you know and how frightened you are, she said. The fact that he called you directly, instead of routing it through his own lawyer, tells me he doesn't think he has clean legal footing. If he did, his attorneys would be doing the talking. She had me write up the call in detail and send it to her that same night, which I did. 2 days later, Victor's attorney reached out through Monica's office, requesting a collegial meeting to discuss estate matters. Monica declined, politely and firmly. We heard nothing else that week. But the threat had landed somewhere in my chest and stayed there, pulsing quietly under everything else I did. I took 4 days off the following week and drove out to my cousin's place near Lake Lure. I told her only that I was dealing with complicated estate business and needed rest. I sat on her dock and watched the water and let myself simply be a person for a few days before going back into the fight. I wasn't beaten. I wasn't going to be. But I needed those 4 days first. When I came home, there was a foil-covered casserole dish sitting on my porch with a note that read, "Thinking of you, Carla." Carla Jennings had been my next-door neighbor for 9 years, a retired ICU nurse with a soft laugh and a green thumb. I stood on my porch holding that dish and thought about how ordinary kindness can undo you completely in the middle of extraordinary stress. I cried a little right there on the steps. Then I went inside, put the casserole in the fridge, and checked my email. There was a message from Walter's brother, Grant. Grant Calloway lived in Charleston and had never been a particularly warm presence in my life. Cordial in the strictly formal sense, a Christmas card here, a birthday text there, but always with some current underneath I could never quite name. Competition, maybe, or judgment. He'd come to Walter's funeral, stayed 2 days, and left without offering much beyond a stiff hug. I hadn't heard a word from him in months. This email was friendly, warmer than he'd ever been with me, which was the very first thing that struck me as strange. He wrote that he'd been thinking about me a great deal, that grief was so isolating, and that he wanted to fly up and take me to dinner to talk about Walter and about what comes next for you. He said he had some thoughts that might help. I read it 3 times. Then I forwarded it to Monica with a single line. I think this is connected. Advice. She called within the hour. She'd half expected something exactly like this. Victor Marsh and Grant Calloway had known each other for decades. Victor had been Walter's closest friend. Grant was Walter's brother, and it would be entirely unremarkable for the 2 of them to be in contact. It would also be entirely characteristic of Victor's approach to send someone I might actually trust, someone with an emotional claim on me, rather than approaching me directly again himself. What does he want? I asked. He wants to know what you know, and what you're planning to do about it, Monica said. And he may be carrying an offer. I wrote Grant back, thanked him for thinking of me, told him I appreciated it, said I was in the middle of some legal matters tied to Walter's estate that had my schedule unpredictable for a while, and that I'd reach out when things settled down. Polite, vague, entirely noncommittal. He replied within 20 minutes. Very warm, very understanding. No pressure at all, he said. Take whatever time you need. The speed of that reply told me everything I needed to know. He'd been sitting there waiting for it. I didn't respond again. What I did do in the weeks that followed was start finding my footing somewhere outside the legal fight entirely. Monica had suggested, quite practically, that I find a therapist, not for crisis intervention, but for the sustained weight of a long legal process. I found a woman named Dr. Lena Brooks, whose office was a short walk from the school. She was calm, dryly funny, and had worked with clients navigating financial trauma before. Seeing her every other week became a kind of anchor point in my week. I also kept talking to Carla, though I kept the financial specifics private on Monica's advice. We talked instead about the loneliness of grief, about the strange experience of realizing the person you thought you knew completely had rooms inside him you were never once let into. Carla, sitting on her porch with sweet tea sweating in her hand, said something that stuck with me for a long time afterward. Renee, the fact that you didn't know doesn't make you a fool. It means he worked very hard to keep you from knowing. That's on him, not you. I had needed to hear exactly that, more than I realized until she said it out loud. Agent Delgado reached out through Monica with a preliminary update. A formal investigation into Cascade Ridge Holdings had officially opened. My status as a cooperating witness was noted and protected. It would be a long process, she said. These things always were. Victor's side went quiet. No more calls. No more emails routed through intermediaries. But I wasn't naive enough to believe he'd simply given up. He was watching, recalculating. Men like Victor Marsh do not walk away from $48 million without trying every last door first. I started locking every door in the house, even during the day. I documented everything. I called Monica weekly, and I waited with a steadiness that genuinely surprised me. There's a particular kind of calm that comes not from the absence of danger, but from a decision, clear and settled, that you simply will not be moved. I had made that decision. I was not going to be moved. They came on a Sunday afternoon. I saw the car pull up from my kitchen window, a rented dark SUV, the sort you get straight off an airport lot. Grant climbed out first in a pressed button-down, wearing the particular expression he always wore when he was performing warmth. Victor Marsh came around from the passenger side. I hadn't laid eyes on Victor in almost 15 years. He was heavier now, gray at the temples, dressed in the deliberately understated way of men who want you to understand, without saying it, that money is not a concern for them. He was carrying a small gift bag. I watched the two of them walk up my front path, took a slow breath, and opened the door before either of them could knock. Renee! Grant opened his arms like we were old friends. You look wonderful. I didn't step back to let them in right away. I stood in my own doorway and said, pleasantly, Grant, Victor, I wasn't expecting you. You should have called. We were worried about you, Victor said, with a smile that had clearly worked on a great many people over the years. We're family, Renee. That doesn't stop just because Walter's gone. They were not, in fact, my family. But I stepped aside and let them into my living room anyway, because I wanted to know exactly what they'd come to say, and because Monica had told me, if they show up in person, let them talk. Document everything. Commit to nothing. We sat down. Grant admired the room in that particular way that really means he's assessing its value. Victor set the little gift bag on my coffee table, a bottle of wine, a small box of chocolates, a performance of normalcy. He spoke first, and I'll give him this, he was skilled. He talked about Walter, about their friendship going back to their college dorm, about how complicated Walter's business life had become in his final years, and how he, Victor, had only ever tried to protect him. He wrapped the whole thing in the language of loyalty and family burden and good men caught in difficult circumstances. "The money in that account," he said carefully, "is complicated, Renee. I think you understand there are parties, and I don't just mean me, who have legitimate claims to portions of it. And the way you're handling this, going through the government, through lawyers, it doesn't protect you. It exposes you. Walter wouldn't have wanted this." There it was. Walter would have wanted you protected. Grant added, right on cue, his voice going soft. "Whatever mistakes he made, he loved you. And right now, the choices you're making could take everything from you. The house, your reputation, your relationship with Ethan. Is that really what you want?" I looked at him, then at Victor. I thought about 24 years of marriage and an account I'd never once known existed. I thought about a voicemail from a man who wouldn't leave his name. I thought about Grant's email, sent 20 minutes after I'd politely declined him. "Victor," I said, "I want to make sure I understand what you're actually asking me to do. Are you asking me to withdraw my cooperation with a federal investigation?" He shifted in his seat. "I'm asking you to consider a private resolution, something that protects everyone. And if I don't—" His smile didn't disappear exactly, but something behind it went cold. "I'm hoping you'll be reasonable," he said. "Walter was, until he wasn't, and then things got complicated for him, too." The implications sat in the room like a held breath. Walter's aneurysm had come out of nowhere on an ordinary afternoon in his own garden. I filed that sentence away in a part of my mind that had gone very quiet and very still. Grant put his hand on my arm. "Renee, please. We don't want this to turn adversarial. We want to help you. There's a number," he glanced at Victor, "that we think would be fair, for you personally. Something that recognizes your position." They were offering me a slice of money that was already legally mine in exchange for walking away from my own cooperation and handing them a clear path to the rest of it. I stood up. "I appreciate you both coming by," I said. "I'll let my attorney know you were here. Please direct any further contact to her office." Victor's composure slipped. Not dramatically. He was too controlled for drama, but the pleasant mask around his eyes hardened. He stood slowly. "You're making a mistake, Renee." "Possibly," I said, "but it's mine to make." They left. I locked the door and stood in my hallway with my back against the wall for a long moment. Was I frightened? Yes. Victor's line about Walter, until he wasn't, was going to sit in my chest for a long time to come. These weren't simply greedy men. These were people who had lived for years in the space between legal and illegal and had grown entirely comfortable there. But the fear did something I didn't expect. It didn't weaken me. It made everything cleaner. Clearer. I picked up my phone, called Monica, and gave her every single word of what had just happened in my living room. I was done being reasonable with unreasonable people. The deposition took place in March, 7 months after my first visit to Monica's office, in a federal building in downtown Charlotte. Long table, fluorescent lights, the particular hush of a room where things are made official. Present were Agent Delgado, a colleague of hers from RSCI, a DOJ attorney named Patricia No, who had joined the case a few months in, Monica, Sam Whitaker, and me. Victor Marsh was deposed separately in a session his attorneys had spent weeks negotiating the terms of. I had gone first, 6 weeks earlier. I'd answered every question we'd prepared for, and a few we hadn't. Through all of it, I told the truth, because the truth was the only thing I owned that was entirely clean. When it was over, Patricia No looked across the table at me and said, "Mrs. Calloway, your cooperation has been noted, and it will be reflected in our findings." That was all. But Monica, in the elevator afterward, allowed herself a small, real smile. I held on to that smile for weeks. Today was Victor's turn. I wasn't in the room for it. That wasn't how it worked. But Monica had arranged to be kept informed, and I sat in a coffee shop 2 blocks away with my phone face up on the table and a cup of coffee I barely touched. Morning light slanted low through the window. People around me talked about ordinary Tuesday things. I sat very still and waited. What happened in that room, I learned over the following hours and days in pieces. Victor arrived with 2 attorneys and the confidence of a man who had walked into difficult rooms before and always walked back out fine. For the first round of questions, he held to the framework he'd clearly spent months building: an independent business consultant, Cascade Ridge, a legitimate advisory firm, the fees paid for real services rendered, no knowledge whatsoever of any fraudulent activity by the developers who'd engaged him. Then the documents came out. Sam Whitaker's records, wire transfers, internal emails between Cascade Ridge and the 3 developer firms, and a set of text messages recovered from a forensic pull of Walter's second phone, the one I'd found once in his truck and been told, and believed was for work. The messages were between Walter and Victor. They were specific. In places, they were almost comically damning. References to the usual split, to moving funds before the audit window closes, to making sure Renee's name stays on the account so it reads clean. That last phrase was the one that hit hardest when Monica read it to me later, sitting in her car in the parking garage, because neither of us could quite face walking back out into public with that sentence still hanging in the air. Making sure Renee's name stays on the account so it reads clean. Walter hadn't put that money in our joint account to share it with me or to build something for our future together. He'd used my name because it made the account look like an ordinary household savings fund. I had been cover for years without ever once knowing it. When those messages were placed in front of him, Victor's composure cracked. Not all at once, he was too practiced for that, but steadily. He tried to argue the texts were taken out of context, that Walter had used loose, imprecise language, that reads clean meant regulatory compliance, not concealment. But Patricia had come prepared for exactly this line, walking him through each message in careful sequence, asking him to explain the context of every single one, until his own earlier answers began to contradict each other. He claimed no knowledge of Walter having concerns about the arrangement. There was a message where Victor explicitly reassured him the exposure's manageable. He claimed Cascade Ridge's clients hired him for legitimate advisory work. An email from one of the developers referenced Victor's adjustment fee for help with reported contract figures. His attorneys called 2 breaks. Each time Victor came back looking a little less certain than before. A man whose carefully rehearsed story was being dismantled one document at a time in a room with nowhere left to redirect the conversation. By early afternoon his voice had tightened, the effort of maintaining control showing through. He built a life on charm and maneuvering room, and neither one meant anything in that room. The documents didn't care about his tone. By the time the session ended, Victor Marsh had contradicted himself on 6 documented points, had been shown evidence directly refuting 3 of his central claims, and had invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination 9 times in the final hour, which, Monica later explained, is an illegal admission of guilt, but it's certainly a clear acknowledgement that honest answers would be damaging ones. Grant was interviewed as a material witness. It turned out he'd known about the arrangement for years. Emails showed Victor had kept him informed specifically to secure his help managing Walter during his final, increasingly anxious months, when Walter had apparently started talking about wanting out. Grant's cooperation with Victor, it turned out, had been transactional, not incidental. When those emails were shown to him, I was told he broke down. I didn't know quite what to do with that information, so I filed it away and let it sit. 2 days later, Monica called with the formal finding. I was classified as a non-culpable third party. There was no evidence I had ever knowingly benefited from the scheme or taken any part in running it. I sat with that news for a long while after the call. The relief was enormous and complicated because being cleared isn't the same as being unheard. It isn't the same as having the husband you thought you had. It isn't the same as 24 years, meaning exactly what you believe they meant. But it was something. It was the truth, on the record, in a federal building. And the truth turned out to be precisely what I needed. The indictment came down in May. Victor Marsh was charged on 5 counts: wire fraud, conspiracy to commit tax evasion, money laundering, obstruction of a federal investigation, and structuring financial transactions to evade reporting requirements. His attorneys began negotiating almost immediately, which Patricia No told Monica was a strong sign they understood exactly how the evidence stacked up. There would be no dramatic trial, most likely a plea, with sentencing guidelines No estimated would land somewhere around 6 to 9 years in federal prison, along with a civil forfeiture order requiring Victor to give up assets tied to the scheme. I read the indictment at my kitchen table, all 26 pages of it, a cup of tea going cold beside me while I sat there with a real estate listing for a smaller house still open in another tab. Seeing it laid out in the flat, precise language of federal law felt different than knowing it only in my own head. It was no longer just my fear or my grief or my suspicion. It was fact, enumerated, sourced, and signed. Grant wasn't charged criminally. His involvement, while knowing, hadn't crossed the line into active participation under the statute. But he was named a relief defendant in the civil proceeding, and the court ordered him to disgorge roughly $290,000 he'd received from Victor over the years, money that had been framed at the time as generous gifts and was now formally established as scheme proceeds. His attorney filed 2 motions contesting the order. Both were denied. The question of the $48 million was resolved over the following months through a careful process between Monica, the DOJ, and the IRS. Of the full balance, approximately $19.4 million was determined to be directly traceable to fraudulent proceeds, the inflated contracts, the laundered cycling of funds through Cascade Ridge, and that portion went to civil forfeiture applied toward penalties owed by the developers and by Victor personally. The remaining balance, approximately $28.8 million, represented Walter's legitimate consulting income accumulated over the years, plus interest, plus funds that couldn't be traced to fraud with sufficient evidentiary certainty under the law. Given my status as the non-culpable surviving account holder, that portion was mine. $28,800,000. I want to be honest about what I felt when Monica told me the final number. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't the clean, weightless feeling people imagine wealth is supposed to bring. I felt the sheer moral weight of it, the practical weight of it, the strange and heavy knowledge that this money existed because my husband had participated in something wrong and had chosen, deliberately, never to tell me. There was grief threaded all through the relief. There was still anger, though by then it had gone quieter and more settled than the sharp thing it had been in those first weeks. And there was the particular exhaustion of a person who has carried an enormous weight for a long time and is only now, finally, being allowed to set it down. But I wasn't going to pretend the money wasn't real. And I wasn't going to be careless with it, or guilty about it, or hand it over to people who had no legitimate claim to it at all. I set up a trust with Monica's guidance and a financial advisor she recommended named Owen Park. We built it conservatively, a portion in treasury instruments, a portion in a diversified index fund, a modest allocation for day-to-day living, and a designated charitable giving account, which mattered to me deeply. I gave a substantial gift to a scholarship fund for first-generation college students at the school where I'd taught for 2 decades. I set money aside for Ethan. The rest I planned to manage slowly, without drama, without the kind of sudden, sweeping decisions that grief and a windfall can combine to produce. I left teaching, though not right away. I finished out the school year, trained my replacement carefully, and walked out with 21 years of goodwill fully intact. My department chair cried a little at the farewell lunch. I had genuinely loved the work, but I no longer needed it to survive financially, and there were other things I wanted to spend my remaining years doing. Victor Marsh pleaded guilty that September to 3 of the 5 counts. The plea agreement recommended 7 years in federal prison and civil forfeiture of assets totaling roughly $12.6 million. His house outside Charleston was among them. So were 2 rental properties in Myrtle Beach. The Range Rover he'd apparently driven to my house that Sunday was seized as well, a detail Sam mentioned to me later with the dry satisfaction of a man who appreciates a complete outcome. Victor would be 61 when he was released, assuming he served the full term. I thought about the man who had once stood in my living room holding a gift bag, telling me Walter would have wanted me protected. I thought about the line, "Things got complicated for him too," and what he'd meant by it, and what he had believed a sentence like that would do to me. In the end, it did nothing except confirm everything I already understood about who he was. Grant called me twice after the civil order was entered. I didn't answer either time. Whatever he wanted to say, apology, justification, some plea for understanding, I wasn't in a place to receive it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. That was a decision I decided I got to make entirely on my own timeline, without pressure and without performance. What I felt in the weeks after everything finally resolved wasn't the tidy, cinematic satisfaction you see in stories that end with trumpets. It was quieter than that. It was the particular piece of a person who has finished doing the right thing, all the way through. The first thing I did, the very first week after the trust was finalized, was buy a plane ticket to Santorini. I had wanted to go for years. Walter had always found a reason to put it off. Too busy, wrong season, maybe next year. I had accepted those reasons the way I'd accepted so many things, quietly, without pressing, without ever asking whether my own wants deserved equal weight in the conversation. There was no one left to negotiate with now, and no reason left to wait. I booked a small apartment above the caldera for 3 weeks and went alone, with one carry-on bag and a Greek phrase book I practiced with at the kitchen table every morning before I left. I didn't take calls. I walked the cliffside paths at dawn. I sat in tiny restaurants and ordered things I could barely pronounce and ate them slowly, without hurrying. I watched the light change over the water every evening and let myself exist without an agenda for the first time in longer than I could remember. Sitting on a low stone wall above the sea one evening, I understood that rest isn't emptiness. It's the thing that refills you after you've spent too long pouring yourself out for everyone else. I came home in July and started making changes with the same steadiness I'd brought to the legal fight, methodical, unhurried. I sold the house on Sourwood Lane. It had been the right house for the life Walter and I had shared, and that life was over now. I bought a smaller place out in Weaverville, close enough to the city to still feel like part of a neighborhood, quiet enough to actually think. A screen porch, a real garden. I finally tended myself instead of just admiring. A small room I turned into a study, painted the exact shade of sage green I'd wanted in the old house for years, and Walter had always talked me out of. I painted it myself on a Saturday, windows open, music playing, something I hadn't done in years. When I finished, I stood in the doorway looking at that color on the wall and felt something loosen in my chest I hadn't even realized was still clenched tight. It was only paint, but it was entirely mine, chosen without a single negotiation. Ethan flew in from Denver that August, and we spent 4 days together, the first real stretch of time we'd shared in one place since his father's funeral. I told him the whole story over 2 long evenings on the back porch with sweet tea sweating on the railing between us. He went quiet for a long time when I finished. He was angry at his father, a clean, sharp anger I recognized completely because I'd felt the exact same thing. I think he was also grieving a second time for a version of his father who had never really existed. I made room for all of it. I didn't try to soften Walter or explain him away. I just told the truth and let Ethan sit with it, the way I'd had to learn to sit with hard things myself, without rushing toward some tidy resolution. By the time he left, something had genuinely shifted between us. We started talking more, not about the case, but about everything else, his job, his relationship, the things he wasn't sure of yet at 30. I had more time now, and I used it. We settled into an easy Sunday phone call that became one of the better parts of my week. We were building something new together, and that felt like one of the few real gifts to come out of an otherwise painful year. I started volunteering at a legal aid clinic downtown, helping people navigate paperwork and understand their rights in plain language. Not law itself, but the translation of it, the part where you help someone understand a system that was never built to be understood by the people it affects most. It turned out that 2 decades of learning how to explain complicated things clearly to teenagers is remarkably useful when you're doing the same thing for adults who feel completely lost. I went in 3 mornings a week. It became some of the most satisfying work I'd done in years, and it reminded me that purpose doesn't require a crisis to exist. It just requires attention. Carla and I grew into the kind of real friendship that needs no performance at all. We signed up for a pottery class together that fall, both of us terrible at it in exactly the same way, laughing until we could barely stand at our own lopsided bowls, which I've come to believe is one of the necessary nutrients of a livable life. We signed up for the next session without even discussing it. We simply assumed we'd both be there. That small, unspoken assumption was its own kind of warmth. We started a running joke about opening a pottery studio one day that neither of us could actually run, just to give ourselves an excuse to keep showing up on Tuesday nights, hands covered in clay, talking about nothing and everything at once. Dr. Brooks and I kept meeting monthly, though our sessions had shifted somewhere along the way from stress management into something closer to intentional reflection. I was learning things about myself, my patterns, the ways I had quietly made myself smaller over the years to keep a peace that had never been as solid as I believed it was. That work was slow, sometimes uncomfortable, and entirely worth doing. And Victor Marsh reported to a federal correctional facility in South Carolina that November. I read the small news item, set my phone face down on the counter, and went out to water the garden. There was nothing left I needed to feel about him. He had assembled his own consequences, year by year, choice by choice. The system had simply, finally caught up. Grant, I heard through a mutual acquaintance the following spring, had sold his house in Charleston and moved in with a family member after the forfeiture order and the mounting legal fees. He wasn't doing well, by all accounts. The financial strain had compounded other things already going wrong in his life. I didn't feel satisfaction at that, exactly. I felt the flat sadness of waste, of a person who'd had chances to choose differently and hadn't taken them. That was a story to carry now, not mine. What I feel about my own life these days is something I hadn't expected to feel again. I feel like myself, not the woman I was before Walter, not the woman I became inside the marriage, not the woman I was during that terrible first year of grief. Something further along than all 3 of those versions put together, a woman forged in a difficulty she never chose, who came out the other side knowing things about herself she'd never had a reason to learn before. Some evenings I walk out to the porch and watch the light fall over the garden, and I think, I didn't ask for any of what happened to me, but I am who I am now because of what I chose to do about it. That feels like enough, more than enough, most days. It finally feels entirely mine. There are still hard nights, still moments when I reach for the phone to tell Walter something before I remember I can't. Grief doesn't close up neatly just because the truth finally came out. But I've stopped waiting for it to. I just carry it now, alongside everything else, quietly, steadily, and keep walking forward into whatever comes next for me. If you found yourself standing where I stood, $48 million, a husband's secret, and a dangerous man on your doorstep, what would you do? I'd love to know. Leave it in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, you know what to do. Thank you so very much for watching, truly.